settle into the head of Moses, he begins to think, who am I? Who am I? Lord, who am I? He asks. I love this question that comes out of Moses' lips because it is not so much a question of insecurity in himself as much as it is a question of Moses' humility. He is so concerned about taking away the glory away from God and that he says, are you sure, God? Are you sure? Me? This is going to bring a lot of attention to me, you know. It's all supposed to be about you, God. That question really shows Moses' heart. It exposes his heart. How many times do we stop and question God? God gives us our call and God gives us instruction and we automatically say yes, right? Sometimes we do say no. Like the first time God called me to ministry, I said no. But when we do say yes, sometimes it's this firm yes, and we go on doing it so happily because God has chosen us. After all, if God has called us, there must be something special about us, right? We begin glorifying our own abilities and our own obedience, and soon enough, we've robbed God of his glory. We think that our crowns glorify God, that our achievements will ultimately give him the glory. But what if God wants the fullness of the glory? What if he wants all of the glory? Moses here was being thoughtful. He was concerned about preserving the glory of God. He probably knew that God himself was supposed to be the one delivering the Israelites out of Egypt. He's probably heard that God had promised Jacob, the forefather of the Israelites, that God went to Egypt with Israel and that God himself would take Israel out of Egypt, because that's what it says in Genesis 46, verse 3-4. So if God was supposed to lead the people out of Egypt, where did Moses fit in this picture? Where did Moses fit in the story of God's glory? Where would God, the extraordinary, fit in this picture if he used this ordinary man to lead the Israelites out of Egypt? If God was supposed to be leading Israel out of Egypt, well, shouldn't he be the one doing it, right? That makes sense. It's logical. Why is it that now the responsibility has shifted over onto Moses? God gives us a promise and then he expects us to act. He says, I'll give you a job, but then he tells you to do something about it. Most of the times, things don't just fall on our laps, do they? God promises that we will have no need, that he provides for us and we don't have to worry, but at the same time, that promise comes with a command to us. Maybe he tells us to pray. He tells us to do something. He says that he will be our provider, but then we have to do something. Our faith requires action. And most of the time, God's promises also require human action. God promises all these wonderful promises, but he is also choosing to use a vehicle, a willing vessel to deliver his promises. God promises that the nations of the earth will be blessed through Abraham, but Abraham had to do something to spread that blessing. God promised the land of Canaan to Joshua, but Joshua had to lead the conquests of Canaan. God promised freedom to the Israelites, but they had to go and cross the Red Sea. They had to leave what was familiar to them. So where does Moses fit in this picture? He fits because God has chosen him. Other than that, I really don't know, since God promised Jacob that he himself would be the one to take Israel out of Egypt. So Moses' response to God's command is the right response. Who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israel out of Egypt? Am I God? No, you are God. But God's response is even more correct. God responds to that statement by saying, but I will be with you. But I will be with you. God replies, and the statement highlights the extraordinary God that he is because it is a play on the words I am. The Hebrew word that is used here is Anoki, and it means I am and I will be. So when Moses asked, who am I? God's response is, I am. I am, and I will be. I am with you. See, it's still all about God. Even though God was commanding Moses to do the work of setting the Israelites free from Egyptian oppression, it was still God's work. And it was still all about God. Moses doesn't have the qualifications to lead people out of Egypt. He doesn't have a PhD in liberation theology. He doesn't even have his bachelor's degree in foreign policy. But God, the omniscient, all-knowing one, he is. And God was going to be, even when Moses was going to do the work that he was charged to do. Seems like God is always using the ordinary for the extraordinary. Not for another underdog triumph story, but to show that he is there. He uses the weak to shame the strong because he is there with the weak. He says, I am, to those who would rely on them. Who am I, God? I am weak. And God replies, but I am. But I am. It's not by our strength that we are able to prosper. It's not by our wisdom that we are able to succeed. It's not by our greatness that we are able to overcome. It's God saying, I am. I am with you. I am with you. I will be with you. So, whenever God tells us to heal someone, may we check ourselves and say, who am I, God, to heal that person? And may God remind us, I am. When God tells us to deliver someone from oppression, may we check ourselves and say, who am I, Lord, to deliver that person? And may God respond to us and say, I am. And when God tells us to share salvation to someone who needs it, may we check ourselves and say, who am I, Lord, to bring salvation to that person? And may God remind us and say, I am. Sometimes in life we come across a burning bush, an ordinary sight, but still an extraordinary experience. The place in which he calls us may be an ordinary place, but God's presence makes it extraordinary. And then he speaks. He tells us to do something. Maybe it's an action required to unlock God's promise. We might as well be ordinary, but God is extraordinary. The actions that we might do might be ordinary, but with God, all things become extraordinary. When he calls us to be the church, may we respond by asking, who are we, Lord, to set people free? Because that's what God hears. He hears the suffering. He hears the cries of the oppressed. Do we hear that too? Who are we, Lord, to set people free? Who are we, Lord, to set the people in this community free, in this church free, in this nation free? And may we hear that voice from the burning bush saying, I am. I am